Stop pushing. That phrase alone can feel uncomfortable, especially if you have spent most of your life believing that effort is the same thing as progress. From an early age, you were taught that if something is not working, the answer is to try harder, push more, think more, do more. And when results do not show up, the instinct is almost automatic. Tighten your grip, increase the pressure, double down on effort. But there is a point where effort quietly stops helping and starts interfering, and most people never realize they crossed that line. Here's the part no one explains clearly. Pushing does not come from confidence. It comes from a subtle form of fear. Fear that if you stop controlling, everything will fall apart. Fear that if you relax, you will lose momentum. Fear that if you are not actively forcing something to happen, nothing will. That fear hides underneath motivation, productivity, discipline, and ambition. But energetically, it feels very different. It feels tense. It feels rushed. It feels like you are leaning forward into life instead of standing grounded within it. When you push, your attention narrows. You stop seeing the full picture and fixate on a single outcome. Your nervous system shifts into a state of urgency. And from that state, your decisions change. You may still be taking action, but the quality of that action is different. It is reactive instead of responsive. It is driven by avoidance instead of clarity. Even when the action looks productive on the surface, it carries an undertone of resistance, because it is trying to escape the present moment rather than work with it. This is why pushing so often produces mixed results. You might get short-term wins, but they come with exhaustion, inconsistency, or the sense that nothing ever quite stabilizes. You solve one problem and immediately feel pressure about the next one. You reach a milestone and feel relief for a moment, then anxiety creeps back in because the effort never really stops. The mind learns to associate progress with tension, and eventually even success feels heavy. What actually blocks results is not a lack of action. It is the internal posture you are taking while acting. When your inner state is braced, guarded, or trying to force life to cooperate, you're signaling that something is wrong right now. That signal shapes perception. You start noticing obstacles more than openings. You interpret neutral events as setbacks. You read delays as failures. And without realizing it, you reinforce the very pattern you are trying to escape. There is another way of operating that feels almost counterintuitive at first. It does not mean becoming passive, careless, or disconnected. It means shifting from force to alignment, from pressure to presence, from effort driven by fear to action guided by stability. When you stop pushing, you give your system space to settle. Your breathing changes. Your thinking slows just enough to become clearer. Your body exits survival mode and re-enters regulation. And from that regulated state, intelligence becomes available again. Think about moments in your life when things flowed without strain. Conversations that unfolded naturally. Opportunities that appeared without you chasing them. Decisions that felt obvious, rather than stressful. In those moments, you were not trying to make something happen. You were available to respond. You were engaged but not gripping. Focused but not tense. That state is not luck. It is a nervous system operating from safety instead of threat. Pushing disconnects you from timing. When you push, everything feels urgent, even when it is not. You rush steps that need space. You force decisions that need clarity. You move before information has fully surfaced. Then when things do not work, you assume the solution is more effort, which only compounds the issue. This creates a loop where activity increases, but effectiveness declines. Stopping pushing is not an act of giving up. It is an act of recalibration. It is choosing to work with reality instead of against it. It is allowing your internal state to lead your actions rather than the other way around. When you are internally steady, action becomes simpler. You do less, but what you do carries more weight. You say no more easily, You wait when waiting is appropriate. You act when action is clean and obvious, not frantic or forced. This shift changes how results show up. They become more consistent, less dramatic, but more sustainable. Instead of bursts followed by burnout, you experience steady movement. Instead of constantly fixing problems, you start preventing them by the way you show up. Your energy stops leaking into worry and overthinking and becomes available for creation. The hardest part about stopping pushing is trusting that nothing essential will be lost when you soften your grip. That trust does not come from positive thinking. It comes from experience. From noticing that when you slow down internally, things do not collapse. They reorganize. When you stop forcing clarity, clarity arrives. When you stop chasing certainty, direction becomes clearer. This is where the real work begins. Not in doing more, but in learning how to remain present without tension. In learning how to act without anxiety. In learning how to let your internal state set the tone for your external results. That is the foundation. Everything else builds on it. When you stop pushing, the first thing you notice is discomfort, not because anything is wrong, but because pushing has been your default way of feeling safe. Effort became familiar, tension became normal. So when you soften, your system does not immediately relax into relief, it often panics. The mind starts whispering that you are falling behind, that you are being lazy, that you are wasting time. This reaction is important to understand because it reveals something crucial. The urge to push is rarely about results. It is about control. Control feels like security, even when it is exhausting. As long as you are pushing, you feel involved, responsible, and necessary. There is a sense of identity wrapped up in effort. The one who tries, the one who carries the load, the one who makes things happen. When you stop pushing, that identity loosens, and that can feel unsettling. If you're not forcing outcomes, who are you? If you're not constantly striving, what justifies your worth? These questions sit quietly underneath the discomfort, and most people never slow down enough to hear them. This is where pushing quietly blocks results. Because the deeper driver is not clarity or inspiration. It is a need to prove something. Prove that you are disciplined enough. Prove that you are deserving. Prove that you are not falling behind. Action taken from that place carries an invisible urgency, and urgency distorts perception. You begin to treat neutral situations as threats. Silence feels like stagnation. Pauses feel dangerous. You rush to fill space instead of allowing information to surface. When effort becomes compulsive, it disconnects you from intuition. Intuition does not speak loudly. It does not shout over panic. It emerges when the system feels safe enough to listen. If you're constantly pushing, your attention is locked onto the next move, the next fix, the next step. You're always ahead of yourself. That means you are rarely fully present with what is actually happening. And when you are not present, you miss subtle feedback that would naturally guide you. There's a difference between intentional effort and pressured effort. Intentional effort feels clean. It has direction without desperation. You know why you are doing something, and you can stop without anxiety. Pressured effort feels heavy. It feels like you're being chased by an invisible deadline. Even rest feels uncomfortable because it feels unearned. This is the kind of effort that looks productive, but quietly drains clarity and momentum. Notice how pushing affects your body. Shoulders tighten. Breathing becomes shallow. Thoughts speed up. These are not signs of focus, they are signs of stress. From that state, the brain prioritizes short-term relief over long-term alignment. That is why pushing often leads to impulsive decisions, emotional reactions, or overcorrections. You do not respond to life. You react to pressure. The irony is that many people push because they believe stopping will slow everything down. In reality, stopping the push often restores efficiency. When tension drops, perception widens. You start seeing options that were invisible before. You recognize which actions matter and which ones were busy work fueled by anxiety. You realize that some problems were created by over-involvement, not neglect. This does not mean you withdraw from life. It means you change the quality of your engagement. Instead of leaning forward aggressively, you stand upright internally. Instead of chasing outcomes, you position yourself to receive information. From that state, action becomes more precise. You move when there is a clear signal, not when discomfort demands movement. One of the most powerful shifts happens when you realize that not every gap needs to be filled immediately. Silence can be useful. Stillness can be informative. Waiting does not always mean stalling. Sometimes it means allowing the next step to reveal itself instead of being forced prematurely. Pushing collapses timing. Everything feels like it must happen now. Alignment restores timing. You sense when something is ready and when it is not. This is why stopping the push often feels like things slow down at first. You are recalibrating. Your system is learning that it does not need constant effort to remain safe. As that trust builds, energy returns. Not frantic energy, but steady, usable energy. The kind that does not burn out halfway through the process. When effort is no longer used as a shield against uncertainty, clarity has room to emerge. You start acting from understanding instead of fear. And from that place, results stop feeling like something you wrestle into existence. They begin to feel like something you cooperate with. When you no longer push, something subtle but important begins to happen in the background of your awareness. You start to notice how much of your previous effort was not actually aimed at creating change, but at avoiding uncomfortable feelings. Boredom, uncertainty, vulnerability, doubt. Pushing gave you something to do with those sensations. It kept you busy enough to avoid sitting with them. When that busyness drops away, those feelings surface, not to punish you, but to be processed. This is where many people misinterpret what is happening. They assume the discomfort means they are regressing, losing momentum, or slipping into passivity. In reality, the discomfort is a sign that you are no longer numbing yourself with constant activity. You are becoming available to your internal signals again. This availability is not weakness, it is responsiveness, and responsiveness is far more powerful than force. When effort is removed as the primary strategy, discernment becomes the new skill to develop. Discernment is the ability to sense what actually matters in a given moment. It allows you to distinguish between actions that move things forward and actions that simply discharge anxiety. Without discernment, everything feels equally urgent. With it, priorities reorganize naturally. You stop treating every impulse as a command. This shift also changes how you relate to time. Under pressure, time feels like an enemy. There is never enough of it, and it always seems to be slipping away. When the push relaxes, time becomes informational instead of threatening. You can sense pacing. You begin to understand that some processes require space, not speed. You stop trying to compress growth into unrealistic timelines, and instead work with its natural rhythm. One of the most misunderstood ideas in personal growth is that more intensity equals better results. Intensity can feel productive because it creates sensation. It feels like something is happening. But sensation is not the same as progress. Progress is often quiet. It shows up as small internal shifts that later produce visible change. When you stop pushing, you become sensitive enough to notice these shifts instead of overriding them. Another consequence of releasing effort-driven behavior is that your decisions become less performative. You stop choosing actions because they look disciplined or impressive, and start choosing them because they are appropriate. This reduces internal friction. You are no longer trying to be seen even by yourself as someone who is always grinding. You're simply responding to what the situation actually requires. This is also where alignment begins to replace motivation. Motivation is unstable because it depends on emotional spikes. Alignment is stable because it is rooted in coherence. When your actions match your understanding, energy is conserved instead of spent. You do not need to hype yourself up to move. Movement feels obvious rather than forced. Pay attention to how your internal dialogue changes here. Under pressure, the inner voice is often harsh, evaluative, and impatient. When pushing stops, that voice softens. Not because you are being indulgent, but because clarity does not require aggression. Clear perception does not need to shout. It simply points. This is especially important when things do not immediately improve externally. Without pushing, there can be a temporary gap where results are not yet visible. This is where trust is tested. Not blind optimism, but grounded trust in process. The understanding that removing distortion from your actions is itself progress, even if the outcome has not arrived yet. As you stay here, resisting the urge to reapply pressure just to feel productive, something stabilizes. Your nervous system learns that stillness does not equal danger. Thought becomes more orderly. Creativity returns without being summoned. You start seeing connections and opportunities that were previously drowned out by urgency. From this place, effort does not disappear. It becomes selective. You apply it where it belongs and nowhere else. You no longer try to carry everything. You respond to what is yours to handle and release what is not. This is not withdrawal from life. It is intelligent engagement. When pushing is no longer the default, action becomes an extension of understanding rather than a reaction to fear. And that is where real change begins to take root. As this new way of engaging with life settles in, you begin to recognize a difference between effort that clarifies and effort that clouds. Clarifying effort has a quiet quality to it. It does not rush. It does not argue with reality. It does not demand immediate validation. It feels almost neutral as it unfolds, steady rather than charged. Clouding effort, on the other hand, is frantic. It carries urgency, self-judgment, and an underlying fear that if you stop moving, everything will collapse. Most people have spent years confusing the second type for the first. When you stop pushing, you finally have the space to observe this difference in real time. You notice how certain actions leave you clearer afterward, while others leave you depleted or mentally scattered. This awareness is crucial because it trains you to trust feedback instead of ideology. Instead of asking whether an action fits a rule, a system, or someone else's advice, you begin asking whether it actually improves your internal state and perception. Over time, this question becomes more reliable than any external framework. This shift also changes how you relate to problems. Under constant pressure, problems feel personal and overwhelming. They are interpreted as evidence that something is wrong with you or that you are behind. Without the push, problems become neutral data points. They are situations to be understood rather than threats to be defeated. This alone dramatically reduces unnecessary resistance, because resistance is often fueled by emotional reactivity, not the situation itself. Another subtle change happens in your relationship with control. Pushing is often an attempt to control outcomes that feel uncertain. It is driven by the belief that vigilance equals safety. When you let go of that belief, control gives way to coordination. You are no longer trying to force life into a specific shape. You are learning how to move with what is already unfolding while still influencing direction through clear choices. This balance is far more effective than domination ever was. You may also begin to notice that your tolerance for complexity increases. When effort relaxes, the mind becomes less binary. Situations no longer need to be labeled as success or failure, right or wrong, working or not working. You can hold multiple variables at once without collapsing into anxiety. This expanded capacity allows for more intelligent responses because you are not simplifying reality just to feel relief. In this state, intuition becomes more accessible. Not intuition as a mystical concept, but as pattern recognition that operates beneath conscious thought. When the nervous system is no longer overloaded by constant striving, subtle signals are easier to detect. You get a sense of timing. You recognize when to wait and when to move. These signals were always present, but they were drowned out by noise. There is also a noticeable shift in how you measure progress. Instead of looking exclusively at external milestones, you begin to track internal indicators. How quickly you recover from setbacks, how clearly you think under pressure, how consistently you act from calm rather than urgency. These metrics are often better predictors of long-term outcomes than surface-level achievements, yet they are rarely emphasized. As pushing falls away, comparison loses its grip. When effort is driven by fear, comparison is constant because it is used as a gauge for adequacy. When effort is guided by clarity, comparison becomes irrelevant. You are no longer trying to outrun someone else's timeline. You are responding to your own conditions. This alone frees up a tremendous amount of mental energy. You may also find that certain goals naturally change or fall away. Not because you are giving up, but because they were never aligned with your deeper values. They were adopted under pressure, not chosen with understanding. Letting them go does not feel like loss. It feels like relief. What remains has more weight, more meaning, and requires less force to pursue. In this phase, patience begins to feel different. It is no longer passive waiting. It is active presence. You are engaged, attentive, and responsive, without constantly trying to accelerate outcomes. This kind of patience supports momentum rather than stalling it. It allows processes to mature instead of being prematurely harvested. Gradually, a new baseline emerges. You are still capable of effort, discipline, and focus, but they are no longer fueled by fear. They are tools, not survival strategies. You choose when to apply them and when to step back. Life becomes less about proving something and more about participating intelligently. This is where sustainable progress is built, not on intensity, but on coherence, not on pressure, but on precision. And from here, results tend to arrive with less drama because you are no longer fighting the very conditions that allow them to form. As this steadier way of operating becomes familiar, you start to recognize how deeply the habit of pushing shaped your identity. For a long time, effort may have felt like who you are rather than something you do. Being driven, being relentless, being the one who never stops trying might have felt synonymous with being responsible, capable, or worthy. Letting go of that can feel unsettling at first, not because it is wrong, but because it creates a temporary identity gap. You are no longer the person who proves value through constant exertion, yet you have not fully embodied the person who moves from trust and clarity. This in-between space is where real transformation happens. In this space, you begin to notice how much of your previous effort was fueled by self-correction rather than self-direction. Pushing often comes from an internal narrative that says something needs to be fixed about you or your circumstances before life can move forward. Without that narrative, action arises from orientation instead of repair. You're no longer trying to compensate for perceived lack. You are responding to what feels most aligned with where you are now. This shift alone can change the quality of every decision you make. You may also find that your sense of time changes. When effort is driven by anxiety, time feels scarce and heavy. Every delay feels threatening. Every pause feels like a mistake. As pressure dissolves, time becomes more spacious. You are no longer racing against an imagined deadline for worthiness or success. This does not make you slower. It makes you more accurate. You stop wasting energy on premature action and invest it where it actually matters. This new relationship with time affects how you learn and integrate information. Instead of constantly searching for the next technique or breakthrough, you start allowing insight to land fully. You revisit ideas not to force results, but to deepen understanding. This depth creates stability. Rather than cycling through inspiration and burnout, you develop continuity. Growth becomes cumulative instead of fragmented. Another important change occurs in how you experience desire. Under pressure, desire feels like tension. It carries urgency, impatience, and a sense of absence. Without pushing, desire becomes quieter and more grounded. It no longer feels like something you need to chase or grab. It feels like a direction you are naturally oriented toward. This shift removes much of the emotional friction that previously interfered with progress. From this state, action becomes more efficient without becoming rigid. You do not need to do more to get better results. You need to do what is congruent with your current state. Sometimes that means acting. Sometimes it means waiting. Sometimes it means simplifying rather than expanding. The key difference is that these choices no longer feel like sacrifices. They feel appropriate. You may also notice changes in how others respond to you. When effort is forced, communication often carries an invisible pressure. There is an unspoken need for validation, agreement, or outcome. When that pressure dissolves, interactions become cleaner. People sense the difference, even if they cannot articulate it. Conversations flow more easily. Opportunities arise more naturally, not because you're trying harder to influence outcomes, but because you are no longer distorting them with internal tension. This phase also reveals how resilience actually works. Resilience is not built by enduring constant strain. It is built by knowing when to apply strength and when to recover. By honoring your internal signals rather than overriding them, you develop a nervous system that can handle complexity without collapsing. This makes you far more capable over time than relentless effort ever did. As pushing continues to fade, self-trust becomes stronger. You stop outsourcing authority to systems, rules, or external metrics. You begin to recognize your own capacity to sense when something is aligned or not. This does not make you inflexible. It makes you adaptable. You can adjust course without self-criticism because you are no longer invested in proving that every decision was right. What emerges here is a form of confidence that does not rely on performance. It is not loud. It does not need reinforcement. It is rooted in the knowledge that you can meet situations as they arise without forcing outcomes prematurely. This confidence supports sustained growth because it is not dependent on constant success. This is where effort transforms from obstacle to instrument. You still engage. You still apply focus and discipline when appropriate. But those qualities are no longer driven by fear or urgency. They are guided by clarity. And clarity, more than effort, is what allows meaningful results to take shape and endure. As this way of moving through life settles in, something deeper begins to reorganize beneath the surface. You stop relating to outcomes as proof of your worth or intelligence. Results no longer define you. They inform you. This subtle distinction changes how you respond to success and difficulty alike. When something works, you appreciate it without clinging. When something does not, you adjust without collapsing. The emotional charge around outcomes softens, and in that softness, learning accelerates. Without the pressure to force progress, your attention becomes more refined. You notice patterns you used to miss because you were too busy trying to make something happen. You see where energy naturally flows and where it consistently stalls. Instead of labeling these observations as failures, you treat them as feedback. This alone prevents years of unnecessary struggle. You stop trying to push life uphill and start recognizing where the terrain already slopes forward. This is also where intuition becomes more reliable. When the mind is constantly pushing, intuition gets drowned out by noise. It cannot compete with urgency. As internal pressure eases, intuitive signals become clearer. They do not arrive as dramatic revelations. They show up as quiet preferences, subtle resistances, or gentle pulls towards certain choices. Trusting these signals does not make life unpredictable. It makes it coherent. Decisions begin to align with each other instead of pulling in opposing directions. You may notice that your relationship with effort becomes more nuanced. There are moments when effort is appropriate and even necessary. The difference now is that effort is applied deliberately, not compulsively. You engage fully when something feels aligned and disengage without guilt when it does not. This selective engagement conserves energy and increases effectiveness. You are no longer spending yourself on battles that do not move you forward. This shift also changes how you experience rest. Rest stops being a recovery from exhaustion and becomes a foundational part of how you function. You rest not because you are depleted, but because clarity thrives in spaciousness. In rest, ideas integrate. In rest, perspective widens. In rest, the nervous system recalibrates. What once felt like lost time reveals itself as essential preparation. As pushing loses its grip, your sense of agency actually strengthens. This may sound counterintuitive, but it is important. Agency does not come from controlling outcomes. It comes from responding skillfully to what is present. When you are not locked into forcing a specific result, you have more options available to you. Flexibility replaces rigidity. Creativity replaces repetition. You become capable of navigating complexity rather than resisting it. Another noticeable change is how you relate to uncertainty. When effort is driven by fear, uncertainty feels threatening. It must be eliminated as quickly as possible. Without that fear, uncertainty becomes informative. It signals areas where growth is still unfolding. Instead of rushing to resolve it, you allow it to clarify itself. This patience often reveals solutions that would have remained invisible under pressure. Your inner dialogue also evolves. The voice that once demanded more, faster, harder begins to quiet. In its place, a steadier voice emerges, one that asks better questions. What matters here? What is actually needed? What can wait? This internal conversation creates a sense of grounded direction. You are no longer being whipped forward by anxiety. You are being guided by understanding. Over time, this orientation reshapes how you define progress. Progress is no longer measured solely by visible milestones. It is measured by coherence, ease of movement, and alignment between intention and action. You recognize that sustainable progress often feels less dramatic than forced breakthroughs. but it lasts longer and integrates more fully into your life. This is also where trust deepens. Not blind trust or passive hope, but trust rooted in experience. You see how often things move forward once you stop interfering with unnecessary effort. You observe how clarity emerges when you allow space. You notice how outcomes improve when action is guided rather than driven. Trust grows naturally from these observations. It is not something you convince yourself into. It is something you recognize. Eventually, pushing no longer feels like strength. It feels like an outdated strategy that you no longer need. You understand that effort applied without clarity is expensive and inefficient. You see that results arise most reliably when your internal state supports them rather than resists them. This understanding becomes embodied, not intellectual. At this point, your life begins to reflect a quieter kind of power. Things still require participation, but not struggle. Challenges still appear, but they do not derail you. You move forward with a sense of steadiness that does not depend on constant motivation. This steadiness is what allows real momentum to build. This is the deeper reason trying harder was never the answer. Not because effort is wrong, but because effort without alignment obscures the very intelligence that makes progress possible. When you stop pushing, you do not become passive. You become precise. And from that precision, results begin to emerge in ways that are not only more effective, but far more sustainable.